Hello and welcome to the 33 Ways Not to Screw Up podcast. I'm your host, Alastair McDermott, and today my guest is my fellow author, Dawn Kristy. And Dawn is a cyber subject matter and insurance expert, experiencing complex risk and claims. And during the pandemic, she became an entrepreneur out of necessity. And she decided to put her 11 years of learning cyber to good use. And she has written a book, 33 Ways Not to Screw Up Cybersecurity, which is also a BookFest award for third place in 2022. So the book addresses cyber threats through scenarios and checklists to help C-suite, non-technical managers and employees become cyber savvy. Dawn, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Alastair. Nice to be here.
So the first thing I want to know is, can you tell us a little bit about how the book came about?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned in the intro, during the pandemic, out of necessity, I had to pivot. The company I was with was struggling, and I decided to start my own business and take time to write a book. I thought this is a good sort of line in the sand moment. Had extra time like a lot of people did during the pandemic at home. So I decided to put my knowledge to better use and write a book. I had written a lot of blog posts and different things, and people said, why don't you put a book out there? And so I spoke to Melissa, who was a friend of mine, and decided to move forward. So I found there was a lack of awareness about cyber threats and how to handle them from working in the insurance sector, especially with the small and medium-sized businesses. So I thought, okay, that's the nugget. Let's address this lack of awareness. And that's what
Super.
drove me to do the book.
So and you say that the book is helping people with scenarios and checklists to help C-suite and non-technical managers. And you're helping them to become cyber savvy. So can you tell us a little bit about like what that actually means to become cyber savvy?
So there's a couple of things. One is people can just go sort of free will and use online devices, right? Without thinking, without knowing about risks, just go on and use it. Not thinking of cyber privacy, diligence, anything like that. So when you're talking about C-suite all the way to the standard employees, it's sort of developing a culture of awareness and a culture of cybersecurity. So to be cyber savvy means if you get an instinct or a feeling that something doesn't sit quite right with an email or a text or something, you may not even think of that until you've had some training or read a book about it, or you may have heard things on the news, but that wasn't enough to prod you to say, wait a minute, this seems strange. So cyber savvy is really just think before you act. Take a moment, pause, and say, this feels strange. And I have a lot of examples of that. But so cyber savvy is really just to be attentive online.
Right. So I'd love to hear about some of those examples so that I can learn from other people's mistakes.
Oh, absolutely. So, there's I think throughout the book, there's the common thread of the human factor. And that's what I wanted to address both in my business and in the book. And one interesting thing, before I tell you a couple of stories, just so you get how voluminous this is, in the spring of last year, the NSA chief made a comment, something to the effect of cyber crimes constitute the greatest transfer of wealth in history. I mean, that's a statement, right? Because it's affecting every country on earth. And so, the cyber criminals are winning. A couple of stories that are sort of, I've blogged on them and I've spoken on them, and I think they're important. And there's a lot on ransomware. I'll get to that as the second story, but there's something called business email compromise. And it's basically when a bad actor gets into a network and is able to do social engineering, which is basically noodle around and learn about correspondence and really step into the shoes often of a CEO, like impersonating the CEO. And so there's two classic scenarios that happen. One is, and there's always, it's kind of like the person that's left behind. And what I mean by that is the person that wasn't trained or isn't cyber savvy is left behind. So it could either be two things happen. One is the long holiday weekend, which you would call bank holiday. That Friday, these often happen because all the banks are shut on the Monday. And the other scenario is when there's the person that's the head of, say, the accounting department or accounts payable and receivable has an emergency. And so the person that's left to substitute hasn't been trained. So I'll tell you the story of that. So one of these is sort of in my book, and the other I've talked about a lot. So I'll do the one about the long holiday weekend. So you've got, the CEO and most of the staff are flying to the islands, taking a break. It's a holiday weekend. And at the end of a Friday, a lot of people are already gone. This accounting manager gets a request to change the banking details, the bank account number, the routing number, et cetera, often with an international transfer. So a couple things happen. He or she may say, well, the CEO is in flight. I can't reach them, right? Because their phone's off. So I'm just going to go ahead and send the payment. So I'm going to send the $300,000 to the new bank without having a double check, without having the verification to say, did you really send me this email, CEO? And so what happens is two things. One, the person either does it or their gut check says, you know what, I'm waiting till Tuesday. I can't check with the CEO and I'm not sending 300K without a double check. Well, what's happened often, and this happened a lot during the pandemic, and they tend to be very high value losses. It's not the volume of ransomware, but they're high value. And so everyone comes back to the office on Tuesday, they had their vacations, and they realize the money that we wired is not appearing. That account doesn't exist. What happened? And so now the panic and the tracking starts. And what happens is that money was wired to a fake bank account, and the account is now closed and the money's gone. And that's called business email compromise. It's also called wire fraud. It's also called fraudulent funds transfer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
pretty simple one.
Yeah, and it's
the key thing there was the original email looked like it came from the CEO, right?
Yes, it's like an imposter email. Everything looks authentic because they've got everything all set up, waiting for that Friday, knowing that somebody's going to be there still handling transactions, and that happens. It can also happen, and this I addressed in the book, where everybody in the firm is trained, but for one person, the deputy who's going to take over in accounting, because the regular guy had to get rushed to the hospital for some reason for a family member. So now you've got the one untrained person. That's why I call it the one person left behind. And what happens is psychologically, people say, well, I'm not going to challenge the CEO and question if he really sent this. I'm going to do it because there's almost like an embarrassment factor. Like, should I double check with the CEO? I'm a substitute. It feels weird. And so in that emergency scenario, they may also wire the money.
Yeah, and you can see in these situations where you have an organization where the CEO is not so welcoming of people challenging them, like not being, they're going in and the security guard at the door asks you to see your ID and they say, I'm the CEO, why are you asking me for ID? Those are the kind of scenarios where you're going to see something like this actually happening.
Yeah. And then the other one, which is, is the sad scenario. If you look in the small, not that the other one isn't sad, but if you look at the small and medium business market, a friend told me about a ransomware attack that she had, which caused her to lose her business. And there's also a small medical practice that I have in the book that lost their business, because if you have a ransomware attack and you don't have the funds to pay the ransom and they've locked your data, at least in some of the cases, they'll destroy the data. And if you don't have a backup or a substitute, you may not be able to recover. So my friend, heartbreaking as it was, ended up losing her business and went back into working in industry. The doctor's story, I actually got choked up the first time I talked about this at a talk, because it was these 60-something doctors, and I think it was in Michigan, and they had a small practice, and they were hacked. They had ransomware. They had no money, no cyber insurance. We'll get to the insurance later. And you know what they decided to do? Close up shop. Now they had to pay HIPAA fines because there's all these rules about HIPAA and when you can close and all of that. But that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is the ransomware attack forced them to retire early, write to all their customers or their patients and say, we're closing, which was a heartbreak for them and all the patients. So there's a whole, besides the money, there's a whole another side of these attacks. It's cybercrime causes a lot of pain.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so
I've seen in my own experience, and I live in the west of Ireland, which is a pretty rural place. And if you think of small town, like small town Wyoming or something is like the town where my parents live. And
okay.
I got it because I'm the tech guy. I get called for tech support by everybody basically. So so I was down
That's
there.
good to know. I might call you.
So I was down there anyway, and the local well we call him the auctioneer here. It's a local real estate agent. He does commercial and residential property. But the lady who worked in there called me in because they had a problem where they had a house on their website which was for sale, and somebody had called them up and said, well, I've sent you on the deposit. When can we meet up and get the keys? And they said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, we were talking by email and we sent you the, 10,000 euro deposit or 20,000 euro deposit or whatever it was. And they said, we haven't talked to you by email. And so they forwarded this email, and it was seemingly from their address, and somehow they had either hacked the address or they had gotten in, made it look like it was from that address when it was from something slightly different. And
exactly.
And so that this person, not only had they lost the money, but they were very upset because they actually wanted to buy the house. And this was some tiny cottage and on the side of a mountain somewhere, but it had been where their family were from originally, so they wanted to get some so these things can happen, like, and that's at a tiny kind of tiny scale, although it's still a significant amount of money.
Sure.
But
and that's all relative to the person losing the money, and there's always the money is sort of like the psychological pain, the reputation. Real estate was hit hard as well, even like with closing fees and going to the wrong place, similar to people stepping in the shoes of you and getting your tax refund. Like, hello, where's my refund? Oh, we already sent it. To who?
Yeah.
So, this whole imposter thing it comes from somebody breaking into your network and noodling around. And that's where the term social engineering comes in. And they can do phishing campaigns. They can do spear phishing directed to one person. And these things look quite authentic. And that's why there's been now an influx of phishing simulation companies that have come up to actually sort of test employees and give them fake phishing emails to see who clicks and who gets fooled and who needs more training, which has its pros and its cons. But
yeah, interesting. So we're talking a lot about email. Is it all through email or what else?
Oh, no. So
what else is there? Can you tell me about
funny.
some of the other aspects of the
well, there's one thing in the book is it's phishing, vishing, and smishing. Vishing is the voice. So like when I call a company and they say, we're verifying your voice, I hit 0 or I hit pound and I don't want them to use my voice. And then they'll say, put the last for the social, and I'll hit 0. And eventually they'll just have me put the card number or whatever. So there's a way around it, but they can actually mimic your voice. Like, hi, this is Alastair. If you answer that way, we were all taught to say, hi, this is Dawn. Not anymore. I pick up a phone and I'm like silent. And then hello. If I don't know the number, I don't pick it up at all. So that's the calling, the voice, and they can call. And then there's the smishing is the SMS. So it's phishing via text. And I can give you an exact personal story. Last week, I ended up changing a credit card password and Amazon password. So I get an email from Amazon saying your payment was denied. Okay. Go right onto Amazon. I don't have a purchase. Go onto the card they mentioned, call the fraud team, no purchase. At the same time, I get a text from something security. Delete the text, read you my password on the 2 accounts, never clicked on the email that said you had an issue with Amazon, click here, this big orange square in the middle. But if you were tired, distracted, and not realizing it, you may click on that. And then they're going to say, please update your credit card information. Then you put it in and it's on their website. It's a feeder. So that's an example that just happened to me last week. And, had I been tired and not thought about it, I could have clicked on it like anyone. That's where this pause has to take place.
Right. So, and this is something you talk about in the book, right? About pausing like that.
Oh, yes. And also this idea of the voice. And, we're getting now to biometrics. Maybe that's a little bit too far afield, but, the fingerprint, the iris, all of these things, if you don't, what they call hash and salt them, they've been from certain databases, like in the Far East and that, where fingerprint records have been stolen. So if somebody is your fingerprint, that's, there's only one of those. So if that can somehow be used, that's the wave of the future, unfortunately.
So in the books in this series, there's 33 mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk through a few more of those just to give us a flavor of what's in the book and what people should be watching out for?
Yeah, so I kind of looked at, if you're going to look at three main focal points of the book, which you could call tips or ways or what have you, right? 33 ways. One is there's three things that I would focus on. One is training, and the other would be like diligent behavior, and the other would be cyber insurance. And those are all in the book. So the training first is, and we've kind of touched on this already with the one person left behind. One person, one password have caused huge breaches, and so you've got Equifax, you've got Colonial Pipeline, you've got, one person that didn't patch for Equifax. You have all these instances of one individual that circumvents the technology. So the idea of training and awareness training, and there was a cybersecurity awareness month, the 33rd chapter I have on cybersecurity awareness training. And the year that month of October started focusing on that, I think was in 2004. So it's been a while. So the thing is, we master things and learn things through repetition. Sport, dance, language. We don't just take one class and say, I'm fluent in Italian now. I took one class. So why would you be fluent in cyber from just having one training a year? So that's the whole idea of the repetitive training that's needed to get in here, right? The other would be sort of diligent behavior. And I think the two important things that people are still not registering is the unique password with multi-factor authentication. They really have to go hand in hand. If the multi-factor authentication is offered, sign up for it. So that can come through a code that's sent to your by text message or email, but it can also be from an authenticator app, which I have one set up through Google, and then you can hold it to a QR code on someone's site, and then you can get it that way. The MFA has been breached. I mean, that has, none of these things are 100% perfect, but it's about like adding layers to your onion, right? Let's add layers. Let's do the unique password. Let's do the multi-factor authentication. So all of these one person, one password scenarios are in the book, right?
Yeah.
Then the
I
third,
think you touched on something important there.
Sure.
And so multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication, sometimes you'll see it written as.
Yes.
All of these things are extra hassle for people, but
I'm glad you said that.
Security has always been a trade-off. More security is more hassle, and less security is less hassle. And if you want to put one tiny lock on the door of your bank vault and it makes it easy for you to open it quickly, well, then you've got lower security. You've got to make that trade-off.
You're in my wheelhouse right there, because I spoke to a group of seniors in Florida last year, and because they were, seniors, I said, do you remember when you had to look at the white pages and the yellow pages to find a contact? And you had to use a payphone, and all of that took a lot of time. And now we have this miraculous tool where you can put somebody's name in and get their stuff in a second. So why not take an extra minute or two to set up a two-factor or multi-factor and then use it? You get a quick code, you put it in, and you at least have an additional layer. And so when you talk about safety and security, and I raise this in the book, when you think about seat belts in the car, when you think about smoke detectors in the house, fire extinguishers in the house, even masks, which we just went through, there is this psychology of resistance where we don't want to be told what to do. But there is a time when, for at least some people, the safety factor finally gets in and like, okay, safety, security, I get it. What drives it, which is the third point I was going to raise, unfortunately, is insurance. So years ago, seatbelts were not used when they first came out until the insurance industry said, we won't pay claims unless you're wearing them. If you're taking, contributory negligence, in other
And
words.
suddenly people started wearing them.
Exactly. So can insurance drive the change over psychological resistance? So, the whole idea of safety and security, to secure your home, to secure your card. Something I bring up in the book too is, if you have a teenager who's starting to drive, you'll say every day, don't text and drive, don't text and drive. It's this idea of repetition. And finally, they'll get it. They won't get it if you just say it once. But every time they grab their keys, you say it again and again and again. And that's kind of what cyber training is. You almost have to be, in some ways beat over the head with it. Like, hey, think. So when you look at cyber insurance and the uptake of that, so it's a really mixed bag, because before the pandemic, which then with the work from home had a huge uptick in claims, prior to that, the claims history was not as severe. So they talk about frequency and severity, it was lower. And the cyber insurance gives you a chance to set up an incident response plan, which every company should have, whether they have insurance or not. You don't decide on the day your screen has the skull and crossbones, oh, I need to know what I'm going to do if my data gets locked. That's not the day to figure it out, right? So this whole idea of insurance driving the change, that's one thing that may or may not happen more over time. But now, because of all the losses during the pandemic, of course, insurance premiums went up like all insurance does. There is some tightening, and there is some requirement that companies be more cyber secure, i.e. cyber savvy. So there's scans that are done, there's questionnaires to say, do you have this? Do you have this? Do you have this? If you say you do and you don't, well, then that's grounds for denial of coverage. So that's a whole nother topic. But the cyber insurance, which is what a big part of my career has been, really illustrated this psychology of resistance, because even some of the smaller companies that get the coverage say, well, I don't need the ransomware coverage, or I don't need the business interruption, or I don't need the business email compromise. I pay all the bills, so I'm okay, But then a year from then, or 6 months later, they hire an accounting manager and forgot that they didn't have that coverage. So they didn't get any compensation for those funds that were lost, So I would say, again, this whole idea of training mixed with behavioral diligence, mixed with, unless you can self-fund a loss, get some insurance to help you fund the loss. So it's not a pitch for insurance. It's simply saying, in your whole risk portfolio, do you have a way to pay for getting your data back, etc.?
Yeah, it's amazing. I think, as I listen to you talking about this, I think it really highlights that probably the most important thing is to have some awareness of
Right.
what's possible, because then you can start to understand the scope of risk. Because if you don't really understand, the different ways that you can be attacked or compromised, then you have no idea what your risk is. And so you've got to try and figure that out first.
Which is why I wrote the book, and I end most of my writing and talks with my mantra, there is hope. Because there's all these studies out showing that businesses don't understand it, don't take preventative measures, feel it's hopeless, there's no way to win, or I won't be attacked, so I don't do anything. And the idea is there is hope. You can actually motivate your team. And, there's stories of companies, you can do role play, you can do interactive training, you can even have competitions. Hey, George discovered a bad email. We're giving him a gift card. He gets the gift card this month. There's ways you can make it fun, like, wow, we stopped that. Awesome. And make it like us against the bad guys. There was for a while, like what I always called the blame and shame culture. So if somebody got one of those emails, it's like, well, why did I get it? Oh gosh, it's like, it just happens. It's not the fact that you did something wrong per se. So don't be ashamed to report it. Because the other thing that happens is somebody will get one of these emails and delete it and not tell anyone. Well, then it goes to the next person and the next person. So they have to know who to tell, to say, hey, we're getting these emails from FedEx that look weird. So we have to now put a communication out. It's all awareness.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's give people some takeaways. Can you give us some actionable tips, maybe 2 or 3 actionable tips that people can, who are watching or listening to this, can actually take away from this and implement?
So I'll give you, again, based on a story from when I spoke to seniors in the Q&A. I had a woman ask me, should I stop using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 as my password on all my accounts? And I said, yes, please.
Possibly you should.
Yes, please. Let's talk after. So the first thing would be, and again, it's this idea of diligence, of password with MFA. And again, we've heard this from time to time. Now it's up to like 12 to 18 letters, make it unique. Don't use a password on more than one account. You can do a long sentence. You can do an acronym from the first letter of a long sentence. You can do a phrase. You can change the symbol on it on different things, but don't do the same thing. Because what happens historically is, and this also just happened to a friend of mine as well. If you were in a data breach, and this is a takeaway, you may have been in a Yahoo data breach where almost every Yahoo account was breached, right? So if you had a password you used for Yahoo and you're still using that on 5 other accounts, when they're using these sort of robotic ways of trying to find where else has this been used, if you're using that, for example, on your Chase bank account, I would change that right now. That's the takeaway. If you've got an old email like Yahoo or AOL, they're the older ones, and you've had that same password for 10 years, and you're also using it elsewhere, as soon as you hear this podcast, please change it. So make your passwords unique. And if they offer MFA or 2FA, take the time to use it. We're not in the yellow pages and white pages anymore. You have time. Can you spare 2 minutes for your security? Right? And then the other thing is, you have to have a plan. You can't just say, this isn't going to happen to me. You have to say, I log on today. Oh my God, it says your system's locked. We want ransom, or call this number or whatever it might be. You have to think, and it's best to do a dry run, whether you're a solopreneur or you have a team. And there's all this pen testing, there's all this fancy jargon, but at the end of the day, it's a dry run on a plan. Who do you call? What do you do if you are attacked? Because that's a term called cyber resilience. If you can't prevent, you have to be able to respond well. And that's this new term that's come out, cyber resilience. So that's the second thing I would say. And then the third would be, how are you going to fund a loss so that you don't go bankrupt? So if you're a large enterprise and you have insurance, the insurance will cover some of it and you've got the assets. But if you're, a 100-person firm and you don't have a financial kitty somewhere and you don't have insurance, how are you going to pay for recovery from the loss? So, these are things, it's almost like when you do your estate plan and you have to do a will and you have to do a living will, and how are you going to be treated when you get to the hospital? It's almost like the same sort of thing, but this is about your business and your digital platform and how you're going to recover. And the other thing you have to think about is this impacts your customers and it impacts your reputation. So if you're a publicly traded firm, your share price could fall. And then you've got shareholders saying, well, why weren't you diligent? And it goes back to that, let's be cyber savvy. So
Yeah, I think that one is really important. Actually, it's something that people don't think about a lot. But your reputation is absolutely at stake,
oh, yes,
and we've seen it in some of the big companies who've been hacked,
yes,
and it definitely took. I mean, I'm sure that people have lost money in terms of stock, trading valuations and things like that.
sure.
So
And then,
okay,
yeah,
so just to recap, on those unique passwords, don't use the same password for everything, and go change passwords that you've had around for a long time as well. Use multi-factor or two-factor authentication when it's available. Have a plan. One thing I was just thinking about that is having lots of backups of your important data.
and that's
Um,
part of your planning.
yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah,
Backups.
um,
And then you get into this issue of you can have them on site and you can also have them off site in the cloud.
mhm,
And if you're a small business, you can still have an external drive. There's
yeah.
things that you can do so that you aren't a victim of the locking of your data.
Yeah, you really can't beat a DVD writer that writes a DVD and then sticking that in the filing cabinet, because a filing
Yeah.
cabinet offsite, because that can't be overwritten. It can always be accessed. Things like that can be really good. And then the last thing we're talking about is funding a loss,
Yeah.
and thinking about insurance. So yeah, well, Don, we are coming up to time. This has
Okay.
been really fascinating, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. The
My
last thing I
pleasure.
just wanted to talk to you about is how you have found the process of writing the book and being part of the series. How has that worked for you?
It's been great to have, well, first of all, working with Melissa Wilson is a dream. She's a fantastic person and publisher. My first book, so it was a great experience, but she has created this authors group, which we're both part of. And so there is this real feeling of exchange of knowledge and support, especially around marketing, because, that's like a whole separate business. After you become an author, it's like, oh, I need to market it now. So that has been really valuable. And then, the authors have opportunities to work together. Those in the 33 Way series, they can collaborate on projects like this podcast. So it's
Yeah,
been great.
yeah, it's great. Like, I get to talk to all the authors, which is great for me because I get to talk to everybody and learn
Yeah,
about their subjects. So,
absolutely.
Dawn, your book is 33 Ways Not to Screw Up Your Cybersecurity.
Yes.
And the listener, you can find that at 33wayseries.com.
Yes.
Dawn, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. If somebody's interested in learning more about you, where can they find you online?
They can find me on LinkedIn. And I also have the Cyber Dawn. So you can just see the cyberdawn.com, which is my website. And yeah, I'm active on LinkedIn every day. You can send me a message and you'll find me easily.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And
Thank you.
we'll have another author for you on the podcast in the next episode. Thanks for listening.
Terrific. Bye now.